So we have two opening panels this evening, and this is the first one, entitled, What Do Human Rights Have to Do with Economic Inequality? We have an exceptional lineup of speakers for this panel, and we decided to structure it more as a round table than a panel, except it's sort of a V, so that if we count all of you, it's some other shape, because we want to try to have engagement among the panelists and the audience. So each panelist is going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes in opening remarks, and then that will be followed by a series of questions that I'll pose, and then we'll open it up to the audience, make sure and have time for that, for your questions. Now, normally we would have our speakers' bios in the programs, and I would say just take a look at those. But given the number of speakers and their impressive biographies, we believed it was a bad idea ecologically, and probably also for your health to have to haul around such a program. So I'm actually going to give you a bit of an introduction of these speakers, and I'll try to do so in a way that connects them to what I think they're going to talk a little bit about. And I'll introduce them in the order on your program, which is the order in which the first round of comments will be delivered. So Radhika Balakrishnan is Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University and the Faculty Director of the Center for Women's Global Leadership. She's an economist, and her work focuses on gender and development and the global economy, human rights, and economic and social rights. She's chair of the board of the U.S. Human Rights Network, sits on the Commission for Gender Equity for the City of New York, and is co-chair of the Civil Society Advisory Program for the UN Development Program. Her research, as well as her advocacy, seeks to use human rights to change the lens through which macroeconomic policy is interpreted and critiqued. She likes small challenges as well. To this end, she has authored numerous articles and has produced a number of books. And she has a book forthcoming that is most on point for this panel. It's entitled Rethinking Economic Policy for Social Justice, the Potential of Human Rights. And not with a question mark. It's clearly asserted.
The radical potential of human rights.
Yes.
No, it's the radical potential of human rights.
Oh. And that is asserted quite clearly and strongly too. Forgive me. So one of the chapters is entitled "What Does Inequality Have to Do with Human Rights?" Which will also be the title of Radhika's opening remarks, and there will be some radical potential in there. Richard Falk will speak next. He's Emeritus Albert G. Milbank Professor of International Law and Practice at Princeton University, and Distinguished Visiting Professor in Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is an international law and international relations scholar who is well known for, among other things, his long critique of the statist framework of the Westphalian International Legal Order and its ongoing legacy in the production of inequality and hierarchies in relations among states. He is Senior Vice President of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and has served on special committees on Kosovo and Palestine, and most recently was UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. I think it's fair to say that I really can't count the number of books he has written on topics ranging from war and human rights to state sovereignty and global governance. And I'm a pretty good counter. His newest book, which I just learned is forthcoming, is entitled Power Shift in the New Global Order. And the title of his opening remarks, in an attempt, I think, to push some of his older work in new directions, is Human Rights and Economic Equality in a State-Centric World. Next, we'll hear from Jamie Galbraith, who holds the Lloyd M. Bentsen Junior Chair in Government Business Relations at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs here at the University of Texas. He is an economist, directs the Inequality Project at the LBJ School, and serves as chair of the Board of Economists for Peace and Security. Relevant to some of his comments today, I suspect, he served as an informal advisor to Yanis Varoufakis, who was then, when he was Greek minister, finance minister, and he did that from February through July of 2015. He too has authored numerous articles and books and book chapters. I think most recently for this, or most importantly for this panel, are also two of the most recent. So one being The End of Normal, The Great Crisis, and the Future of Growth in 2014, and Inequality and Instability, a study of the world economy just before the Great Crisis from 2012. His opening remarks are titled Inequality and Human Rights, What Can We Learn from the Data? And in the first round, the last speaker will be Rodrigo Uprimny, who is professor of constitutional law, human rights, and theory of the state at the National University of Colombia. He is also co-founder and director of Dejusticia, a Colombian human rights NGO and think tank. He holds a PhD in political economy in addition to his various law degrees, and his work centers on the tensions between law and economics, social rights, judicial systems, and transitional justice. He currently serves on the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as on the International Commission of Jurists. He has numerous publications in both Spanish and English, many of them on human rights and Colombian constitutional law, a recent one which was published in the Texas Law Review. And he is entitled his opening remarks, Equality and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Synergies and Tensions. Now, I will say that this was originally conceived as an economist speak to lawyers panel, but I realized that everyone has some degree in economics, even Richard from his undergraduate degree, and then, of course, Rodrigo, the political economy, so we'll let people break out of their roles a little bit. But we posed them an initial question of, what does inequality have to do with human rights? And Radhika will begin.
Thank you very much. I just have one correction to make on the intro. It's one of these things with the web, something starts and it never goes away. I'm not on the board of the U.S. Human Rights Network anymore. I was for a long time, but I am on the board of the Center for Constitutional Rights. So just wanted to make sure that the network doesn't get angry with me because they're saying that I'm on the panel.
And must have just happened, actually.
No, it's if you Google, things show up. And they're not always current. So it's not a big problem. I still love the network, so it's not an issue. And the other thing that I just found out today was that the book is no longer forthcoming. It was released today. So in the 5 minutes to 7, I'm going to try and do 7, on what does human rights have to do with inequality, I think we've already heard in the introduction the importance of the discussion on inequality. They're extreme. They're in many countries. They're around the world. And there's been an upward trend in income and wealth inequality since the 1980s, in particular in the 1990s, even worse. So I think there's global attention to it. There's market increase in media attention to it, and also politicians are finally talking about inequality. So I think it's a moment in history where those of us who've been working on inequality for a very long time are finally saying, okay, you finally figured out that this is a problem. So inequality can be defined in various ways. It's a generic term, and there are distinct kinds of inequalities. So I want to make one distinction in terms of the way I'm going to address this issue, is the distinction between horizontal inequality and vertical inequality. And horizontal inequality is defined as inequality between culturally defined and socially constructed groups. Inequalities with respect to gender, race, ethnicity, religion, caste, sexuality are examples of these kind of inequalities. Vertical inequality, on the other hand, is between individuals or between households, and the overall income and wealth distribution of an economy reflects more the vertical inequality than the horizontal, though they're connected. They're not separate. The distinction between horizontal and vertical inequality is really important in terms of talking about human rights and the human rights framework, because I think the issues of horizontal inequality are addressed in a much more robust fashion than vertical inequality. So how do we now address these issues of vertical inequality? So I'm going to really only focus on the vertical one, but also in its intersection with the horizontal ones, because they're not separate. And human rights at its core has the principle of non-discrimination and equality. And so how do we actually use that principle to talk about vertical inequality, and that the realization of rights should not differ across individuals based on all the categories that I just mentioned. The distribution of resources in a society that's consistent with human rights would be one that guarantees individuals an equal enjoyment of the realization of basic rights without discriminatory outcomes, as an example. And here, when we started writing this chapter on inequality, what we were trying to figure out is, well, is inequality in and of itself bad in terms of human rights? Or is it that poverty is bad? And does inequality necessarily create poverty? And so those were the questions we were trying to deal with in this chapter. So if we had an unequal society, high levels of inequality, but the people at the bottom, the poorest, were doing really well. You have a big state, there's provision of health care, there's education, there's food, but it's an unequal society. Is that okay? Is human rights going to say anything about an unequal society where the basic, the minimum core is being met? And so then what we tried to do is to look at, well, if that is the case, that inequality per se is not bad, but it's the consequences of inequality that we want to look at. And does it create poverty? And in some cases, yes, in some cases, no. And if the poorest are doing okay, then what do we do? So what we did is then try to look at data on what we could show. Wow, 2 minutes, really? Okay. What we could show in terms of inequality. So I'm going to go off my script and speak really fast. So we looked at three things. One was we looked at data on health. And we saw that from the data that inequality, even in rich countries, actually have worse health outcomes, whether you're rich or poor, right? So inequality in and of itself has an implication for the right to health. The second issue we looked at was on housing. And we looked at data on housing in especially areas where housing is limited, so it's not sort of vast, let's say urban environments, that inequality decreases the availability of housing for the poor. So I live in New York, so anybody who, and I think last time I was in Austin, there was a lot of work about the gentrification and what it's doing to the taxes on households and how poor people are losing their households because of it. So inequality in and of itself has a huge implication on the right to housing. And the last one, and maybe we'll come back to this in discussion, is really the ownership of economic policy. And what does inequality do in terms of how economic policy is made that then creates other issues in terms of, and I know there are people here going to talk about tax policy, but one of the things that we saw that, for example, in India, as inequality has risen and the number of billionaires has increased and the kind of capture of the state, the amount of taxes paid by the rich has gone down. There's been a change in tax policy, and therefore maximum of available resources, if we're going to look at human rights norms, have been reduced because the amount of income that's being taxed has been reduced. So I think the kind of the political economy effects of inequality is in terms of the issue of how policies are made. And I think in the United States, given the current mood and the election climate, I think the capture of the state and inequality is a really important one for us to discuss.
Thank you. Richard.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be participating in this conference and particularly on this panel. In preparing to make these remarks, I was reminded that the two areas in international relations and international law, with an emphasis on human rights, that have been most neglected over the course of my academic lifetime until very recently, are first religion and second economic inequality. They were really neglected. If you look at the kinds of teaching materials that were used until the Iranian Revolution occurred, you'll see no reference to religion. And even much more recently, no interest in inequality as a focus for attention. And yet, just now, or very recently, Obama made an extraordinary statement saying that unequal income is the defining challenge of our time. Now, that's an extraordinary shift from non-awareness to primary salience. And it seems to me, in thinking that it poses two puzzles. Why was it ignored before, and why has it become so much a focus of interest now? Because it's not the presence of extreme poverty. That's existed for a long time, and arguably was worse when inequality was not an object of attention. So it's something. It's true, as Radhika suggested, that trends are toward increasing inequality, but I don't think it's that. I think, particularly looking at the United States as a kind of accentuated case of what neoliberalism is doing to the world, it's a case that the middle classes, or a large proportion of the population other than the poor, have been suffering from stagnant wages and a declining standard of living. And it's that which makes the issue of inequality what I would call politically toxic. The extreme poverty was and remains morally toxic, but it doesn't translate into political toxicity until it affects the constituents that are relevant to the political power structure and the existing establishment. And it's also interesting that the moral toxicity is acknowledged in human rights law, in the Universal Declaration and the Covenants, but it's not really very seriously implemented because, again, it doesn't pick up the political dimensions of toxicity. And I think it's important to understand that the reality of political toxicity has to do with the system, the structure of the economic life that exists. And that structure is informed by this particularly maldistributive form of capitalist world economic policy. The shift from Keynesian economics to market fundamentalism or the neoliberal consensus represents, I think, the underpinning of this this accelerating form of inequality. So it raises the question: how can you address the moral toxicity of not not implementing economic and social rights within this ideological and structural framework that contemporary capitalism possesses. And I would argue that you could make important reformist improvements by a shift back in the ideological direction of Keynesian economics, the kind of vision that Bernie Sanders is projecting at the present time would do quite a bit in terms of dealing politically with extreme poverty, and also with the other toxicity of contemporary inequality, which is the grotesque wealth of the very top 100, or however you measure it. Those individuals, from the Koch brothers to Gates and Soros and Warren Buffett, have an influence disproportionate to the way individuals should function in a contemporary democratic society. In other words, democracy is threatened by this form of what I would call moral toxicity at the top of the income distribution. And so in conclusion, I would say that it's possible to improve this situation at the top and the bottom, but it would require a radical shift in domestic politics. And if one wants to really, in a systemic way, address these, what I'm calling the moral toxicity of inequality, one needs to transform the capitalist underpinnings that now prevail ideologically and structurally. Let me stop there.
Jamie.
Thanks very much. Also, quickly updating my introduction, I have two new books. One of them is called Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know. It was published in March by Oxford. And the other one is called Welcome to the Poisoned Chalice, The Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe, and that's coming out in a month or so from Yale. What can we learn from the data? I think the first important thing to say is that we must be very cautious about reifying inequality statistics as social indicators. Much of what's available in the international information set is either not reliable or involves non-comparable concepts. Making comparisons is something that has to be done very carefully. Just as an example, and I've seen many of these, if you see a table in which India has an inequality measure similar to that of Sweden, you know something is wrong. I can tell you what it is. That would be another talk. But even with reliable figures, the psychological and social effects of inequality depend upon the frame of reference of the individuals involved, which may not and probably do not correspond in most cases exactly to the national frame of reference on which the data are collected. So you may want to know whether what matters to the people involved is the inequality at the local level, the regional level, the national level, or in a transnational frame. And those frames can change. And just to take an example of that, if one considers the population of Europe as Europeans, as an integrated whole, that body is substantially, vastly more unequal than the population of any specific European country, and particularly North Europe, because we have to take into account the international differences. Now, if they're socially relevant, then the stresses that are involved here will be greater for the continental population than it would be for a population considered at the national level. So this is a very, I'd say, perilous business. But that said, there are many ways in which inequality connects to human rights, which may elude precise measurement but do not escape common sense. Oligarchy is the enemy of the demos, as the Athenians have been known since Socrates, and since Giannis uttered those words to me, "Welcome to the poisoned chalice," on my arrival at the Greek Finance Ministry on the 8th of February of last year. I've had this message very much in mind. Or to take my favorite sentence from The Wealth of Nations, which I've quoted many times, Adam Smith wrote, "Wealth is power, as Mr. Hobbes says." And I just love that, as Mr. Hobbes says. A crucial economic inequality relation since the dawn of time is the relationship between creditors and debtors. It's formally a contract amongst equals, but in fact it's profoundly unequal and is the source of indenture, peonage, slavery, the mafia, and Donald Trump. Within countries, the existence and effectiveness of financial regulation, of usury laws, access to bankruptcy, are the foundations of freedom from this particular form of peonage and indenture. And the potential to discharge debts, that's to say, for example, the student loans in the United States or mortgages in Spain or consumer debt in Greece, has been something which has been under attack in recent times. And those attacks represent a reduction in the sphere of freedom and human rights of the populations involved, and for very specific reasons, in order to restrict the ability of people who fall into debt to escape from it if they cannot pay them off. Between a country and its private creditors, the concentration of creditors is also a very significant factor. If a government, if Louis XV is in debt to Rothschild, or a government is in debt to J.P. Morgan, or the present United States government to the People's Bank of China, that is a very different situation from a government whose debts are primarily held on a very widely distributed basis by its own households and citizens. And in fact, one can say a foundation of the expansion of democracy in the 20th century was the distribution of debts, mainly in the two world wars, over the entire domestic populations of the major democratic combatants. That's why, a major reason why suffrage was extended after the First World War, and why social democracy came to be the dominant political form after the Second World War. Between countries, the relationship between the country and its creditors, the structure of its creditors, is extremely important. An example of that, in 2010, the Greek debts passed from the hands of the European banks into the hands of European governments. And as a result, what would have been debts that would have been written off, and the remaining private sector debts were largely written down in 2012, became unnegotiable. And Greek government power passed entirely into the hands of the German Ministry of Finance and the IMF. In other words, an independent country in the European framework was transformed into a colony, a fact that became brutally apparent to the Greek electorate in July of last year. Going back finally to measures of inequality, one thing I do find is that a close investigation does show a relationship, a very distinct relationship, between rising inequality and increasing financial power, concentration of financial power. Inequality rises, and this is something you can detect in the data if you're careful with it, as debts pile up. And it declines when they default, are renegotiated, or are canceled. Inequality can and does decline. It declined after 2000 in much of Latin America and other parts of the world, including Russia and to some degree in China. And that is in part due, especially in Latin America, to the deliberate policy move away from the acceptance of the neoliberal Washington consensus of the previous 2 decades. So it does matter. It's not an easy process, but it is one that deserves sympathetic attention. Ultimately, debts that can't be paid won't be paid. And the issue is not only how much inequality you can tolerate, but how much pain and poverty you have to endure before that reality is faced. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. What I'm going to try to do is to show the complex relationships between inequality and human rights by using some kind of metaphor, if you want, a Hegelian dialectic scheme. I will begin with a thesis that states that social rights and equality are almost fused, are almost the same thing, and have strong ties. Then I will describe the antithesis, according to which social rights and equality are not only disconnected, but in some cases can contradict each other. And I will try to propose a synthesis in which, while recognizing that there are different fields and that they have some kind of autonomy, social rights and economic equality should have stronger ties. Then let me propose the thesis, the fusion between social rights and social equality. Let us think about two moments in history, the Mexican Revolution or the welfare state after World War II in Europe. In these two scenarios, you will find that there is a very strong relationship, even a fusion, between the fight for social rights and the fight for equality. They were thought almost as the same. Why was this the case? It was first a case of context. There was a period in a time in which there was widespread poverty, but a strong sense of solidarity, either because you were getting out of a revolution or getting out from a war. And so in that case, it was thought that if you want to have stronger social rights, you have to have redistributive policies, that you couldn't have one without the other. And so in those cases, either in the Constitution, in the Mexican Revolution, either in other legal texts, it was stated that the state has a duty to redistribute and that citizens have social rights. It was possible thanks to the so-called social democratic compact that developed in Europe in those years and that achieved strong realization of social rights and a very deep reduction of economic inequality. Then let me state the antithesis. And the antithesis is the disconnection between human rights and social rights and economic equality in the international legal human rights system. If you read the covenants of human rights, even the covenant of economic, social, and cultural rights, you will not find any right to have economic equality. You will have rights about what Radhika called horizontal equality, non-discrimination, but not about economic equality, vertical equality. You don't have any text that states that. The only text that said it is a text that whose value in international law is controversial, which is the Declaration about the Right to Development that states about the equitable sharing of the fruits of development. So theoretically, you can imagine, as Professor Moyne of Harvard says, that in a sufficient affluent society, you can have a dictator that owns everything, but is generous enough to provide social services to its citizens. So the citizens will have their rights fulfilled, and you will have extreme inequality, as rights are not stated as right to redistribution, but right to basic social services, right to get out from a floor of destitution, but there is not a ceiling on inequality. So in those cases, you can arrive at this disconnection. And you see that with courts that works with social rights, or even the international monitoring bodies that doesn't stress the issue of economic inequality. Let me put an example. Today, I'm very happy because I was informed 1 hour ago that Colombian Constitutional Court, after a litigation that we made with other organizations, have declared the gay marriage in Colombia. It's a success victory about horizontal equality. And the Colombian Constitutional Court have made a lot of things about that, but you don't find a really good decision about vertical inequality. But even worse, sometimes you can find contradictions between social rights and economic inequality. For instance, if you think of social rights as individual entitlements in which you can go to courts to claim them, then there is some evidence, as Daniel Brinks have shown is not strong evidence, but some evidence that in some cases it can have a regressive impact. It can increase inequality. And in other, so you can have those tensions. That's the antithesis. Then let me finish with the synthesis. And what could be the synthesis? I think that in our time, we need to build bridges and searching positive interactions between social rights and economic equality, but without collapsing the two fields, recognizing that there are fields that have some autonomy, but that you have to establish strong relationships. And I would argue that this connection cannot be established only in normative grounds. If you try to find international text that states that you have a right to economic inequality, you will not really find it. But that you can find it in empirical grounds. And we have had here very good examples. Radhika researchers have shown that in certain countries, if you have economic inequality, then the outcome in relation to social rights is worse. So you can say that inequality is a factor that undermines social rights. And then you have a good argument to say that you have not a direct right of equality, but that the state has to reduce inequality in order to have better outcomes in relation to social rights. And then you have here an argument. And then you can see the other argument, and I will finish with that. The second argument is that you have to analyze which social rights have more potential to increase equality. If you recognize that some kinds, social rights as legal entitlement can have counterproductive impact in relation to equality, you have to focus your research in which are the rights, the social rights, and the social litigation that have more potential in relation to equality. And I think that in that sense we can build bridges between the field of economic equality analysis and the bridge between social rights in a positive manner. Thank you.
Great. I think we should give everyone a round for the first round. Terrific opening remarks, and you can start to see the synergies and tensions. I think I'd like to ask a second round of questions now and give each speaker 3 to 5 minutes to respond. And really, I'll go in reverse order because it's starting where you just left off, Rodrigo, which is, I'd love it if each of you could give a concrete example of an issue you've worked on, a particular case study, research, so it can be from your activism or your research, or something else, but about that really shows the need to think about distribution and human rights in relationship to each other. So you started to, it seems like with Rodrigo, you could, in terms of your thinking about the synthesis, could you give us, you started to give us some examples, but maybe you could go into a little bit more detail about how that might work.
Thank you, Karen. I have 2 examples. It's not that I'm very quick of thinking because she made us this question yesterday night. So I have the whole night to think about these 2 examples. The first example is about my work in the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. We have the last year to examine 2 countries, many more countries, but 2 countries that were very interesting because they are middle income countries. They are not very poor countries, not very rich, but middle income countries, but very unequal. It was Paraguay. It's almost the story of many Latin American countries, and Namibia, which has the worst Gini coefficient of the world. And in those 2 cases, I think it was the first time that the committee said to the states, if you don't reduce your inequality with more progressive tax policies, then you will be able to extract all the necessary resources to fulfill your duties in relation to social rights. So that's a way in which, in an empirical way, not in a normative ground, but in an empirical way, the committee says you have some kind of duty to redistribute. And I think it was important. You can find this consideration in the concluding observation about Paraguay. In Paraguay, it was just one sentence, but in Namibia, it was a whole paragraph. So I think it's important. The second one is about the issue that Daniel Brinks has studied a lot, about justiciability and the relationships between justiciability of the right to health and inequality. And we made a research with a colleague about the Colombian case. And what we show, I think what we were able to show is that you have some kinds of justiciability that increase inequality, that are regressive. But you have other forms of justiciability that, on the contrary, have a redistributive function. And then you can be more, if you want, more subtle in the analysis of justiciability, trying to show when there are synergies between social equality and justiciability and when there are tension and contradictions.
And could you just add which ones were with?
The ones that tend to increase inequality is when you have massive individual litigation without structural response from the state, in which, for instance, in the Colombian case, you have a state health plan, and people ask for services that were outside the state plan, saying that it's crucial for the right to health. When judges tend to allow these services, and it becomes massive, but you don't have a structural response of the state, then these cases tend to increase inequality because those who access courts are usually middle and high-class persons. But on the contrary, when you have a kind of litigation that make a response, a structural response for the state, either because the courts make the response or the courts order the response, then the decision usually have a redistributive function.
Okay, thanks. Jamie, you started the example of Greece. You might want to continue there, or maybe you have another example.
Well, Radhika brought up the right to housing as a human right. And so one could usefully begin a discussion of debt in that context. This was a experience that we went through in this country in the crisis after 2007, in which a great many people who had been marketed fraudulent mortgage loans or home repair loans of various kinds that had greatly increased in their face value as a result of refinancing and flipping, found themselves in loans that were programmed to be unpayable within a very short period of time, found themselves unable to pay and therefore open to foreclosure from their homes, with the effect on their neighbors who remained solvent that their neighborhoods collapsed and their own and the homes that were continued to be whose debts continued to be serviced also deteriorated remarkably in value to the extent that entire neighborhoods, and particularly African American neighborhoods in northern cities like Cleveland, were destroyed. That strikes me as an instance of financial relations gravely infringing on the rights of the citizens and members of the community. To take this over to Greece, exactly the same thing is happening now, or in the process of happening now. Greece is a nation with a very high home ownership ratio, it's 67%, the highest in Europe. But what's happening is that with extreme rise in taxes and reduction in pensions, reduction, layoffs of the civil service, reduction in private employment, the Greek population is unable to meet its mortgages, and the Greek courts are being pressured to accelerate the foreclosure proceedings, which will dispossess Greeks, especially of their traditional homes out on the islands or in the mountains or in the desirable property areas. This is not accidental. It is a land grab. It is a land grab compounded by accelerated bankruptcies of local businesses and fire sale of every public asset that the state happens to own that might conceivably of interest to a monopolist coming from somewhere else who would like to pick up a property. The entire Greek banking system was sold off recently at fire sale prices to American hedge funds. All of it. All 4 major banks. This is something which has happened to a country which fought rather vigorously on numerous occasions in the last 150 years for its independence. So those are the kinds of concrete examples that, that come to mind for me.
Great, thanks. To you, Richard.
I was led to think about the work I had done many, many years ago in the International Court of Justice representing Ethiopia and Liberia in a case against South Africa during the apartheid period. And what that, why that seems relevant to what we're talking about today is that it confronted me with this circumstance of radical, multidimensional, vertical inequality and discrimination, and at the same time was rationalized. It constituted the greatest imaginable and pervasive violation of fundamental human rights I had ever encountered, and yet it was rationalized by the lawyers for South Africa as a benevolent system of separate development, you know, under using a language that suppressed the human rights dimensions and also was insensitive to the radical deprivation of fundamental social and economic and cultural rights. And so that to me was the most severe instance of what I was calling in my opening remarks a toxic form of inequality. And a morally, and it became legally and politically. It's an example. Apartheid is an example of a radical form of inequality that fused the moral, legal, and political. And that hasn't happened with poverty, and it hasn't happened with other forms of inequality. I would just this experience also was reinforced while I was special rapporteur dealing with Palestine in the relationship between Israeli settlers and the indigenous Palestinian population in the West Bank, where again you have pervasive inequality disguised by some political language, and it is an example of what this framework. It's morally toxic and legally toxic, but not politically toxic, and therefore it persists. See, and you need these 3 levels, I would argue, of assessment to understand when a form of inequality becomes unacceptable in ways that produce change.
Thanks. Radhika.
Yeah, we were told last night, and I said I'd figure it out, and I forgot. So I'm going to come up with an example. Yeah, exactly. I went out to dinner, and I forgot. But I actually have two examples, and one follows up with what Jamie was saying, which is the issue of credit. And I just want to put a couple of numbers to the issue of credit in terms of the issues of horizontal equality. So the Consumer Federation of America looked at the race and gender dimensions of the subprime mortgage lending crisis. And they found that 24% of male borrowers received subprime mortgages, compared to 32% of female borrowers. They also found discrimination between different racial groups. About 20% of white borrowers and 13% of Asian borrowers received subprime mortgages. This is in 2005, compared to 40% of Latino borrowers and 50% of African-American borrowers. And African-American women were 5.7% more likely to receive subprime mortgages than African-American men, and 256% more likely to receive them than white men. And so I think when we look at the issue of this financial crisis, they actually do have very intensely racialized and gendered dimensions of it. And I think we can't separate those out when we just look at finance. And so I think one of the things that we need to bring about, and we've all sort of hinted on it in different ways, is just the whole financialization of our global economy. I mean, it's neoliberal policy plus. It's the role of the finance sector, the creditors, the role of the creditors, the regulatory changes that have taken place that allowed for this crisis to happen, I think is a really critical one. And so if you look at inequality numbers, neoliberal policy has been doing quite a number on the world since the 1980s, but the inequality numbers go kind of crazy after the 1990s. And so that is really the regulatory changes. And in terms of human rights, it's about the obligation to protect. And I think the obligation to protect is about regulation. I've said this many times before, but, 4 guys went into a room and made Citibank Citicorp. And we're all living with the consequences of that now. So I think finance and what we do with finance. And the other example that I want to make is the issue of volatility of the economy and crises and the impact of the crisis. And I'll just use one example in terms of a gendered analysis of the impact of the crisis. And for example, in the U.S., there was a Recovery Act, but and not well done and not adequate. But for example, in Spain, one of the people I spoke to when I was there gave me an incredible, stark example of the impact of austerity in Spain in terms of inequality and access for women. There was a woman who was living in an abusive household with children, and because of the austerity program, the domestic violence shelter that was near her house was closed because the budgets for that were cut. She didn't have a job. She lost her job and had to stay at home. They didn't have money for daycare so that she could leave the children to go to a place farther away, so couldn't go there. Was economically dependent on the abusive spouse because she couldn't get a job. And also, when people's incomes reduce, women end up increasing the amount of unpaid work that they do in order to cook more food that's cheaper, that takes longer. They end up taking care of the kids when they're sick, not going to the hospital. So when we think about inequality and the impact of these crises in terms of a racialized and gendered way, we need to look at not just monetary effects, but the non-monetary effects that are felt very much in terms of increasing women's unpaid work.
Well, thank you all. We now have a lot on the table. I just want to, one thing I'd like to note maybe from the responses and the examples in the original interventions is, I think everyone but Rodrigo said something about the United States. And you gave us an example where actually human rights seems to have more traction maybe in a country, right, in Colombia, than a discussion about inequality might have. But in the United States, human rights doesn't get us very far, and yet inequality now seems to be something where there's more space to talk about. So I promised in the introduction that we were going to hear different ideas about what inequality was, not just how to measure it, but where to look for it. But I also think that we're going to hear a lot about different conceptions of human rights. And sometimes it depends on whether we're talking about law or we're talking about movements, and whether we care whether people mobilize around a language of human rights. And so I'll have to respond, but if anybody would like to say a word maybe about that, about what it would mean to mobilize around inequality, say, as opposed to mobilizing around, does it matter if we use the words human rights?
You're looking at me.
Sure.
No, you're just staring. It's interesting. I think the traction in terms of the language of human rights is increasing. I was on the board of the U.S. Human Rights Network, and when we started, we were 60 organizations and a couple hundred members. There's now 400 organizations that are members, going from the ACLU to the Mississippi Workers Alliance, a broad range of people who are actually using the human rights framework. And I think what it has shown, since we're talking about the U.S., is that there are arenas where you could go to show the kind of struggles. And I'm thinking of the Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council as an arena. I mean, since the U.S. has ratified so few treaties or covenants, the UPR process is actually a really interesting place for people and movements, more movements, to go to that arena to show the kind of human rights violations that were taking place. And the two UPR reviews that the U.S. has gone through, the first one was right after the financial crisis. And Nico here and we all actually submitted to the UPR process a review of economic policy of the U.S. post-crisis, and the last one was just last year, and we submitted another one in terms of the recovery and what the impact of the recovery was in terms of discrimination. And so there are arenas in which we can use it, and people came together on criminal justice, economic policy, I mean, a whole set of issues, but came together to go through that process, and then came back and still knew each other. And so I think there's an arena that human rights kind of gives. And then one other is South Africa. I was in South Africa last year working with the National Human Rights Commission, just so that it's not U.S.-centric. And there, I mean, the National Human Rights Commission has the right to hold hearings and bring people to account. And we were trying to work with them to try to bring the central bank to a hearing to look at central bank policy and see whether it actually promoted employment or not. I mean, we're still working on it. As you can tell, there might be some pushback. But I think one of the things that human rights in terms of movement building does, it gives us arenas in which you could go to really hold your government to account. Not that that's going to change the government's policy, but then when you come back, the organizing that takes place afterwards is the most important one.
Just to add a few things to what Radhika said, it seems to me there are two big advantages to relying on a human rights discourse. One of them is that human rights is grounded from the Universal Declaration onwards on the sense of the dignity of the individual as a moral legal underpinning. And that's different than making poor and other needy individuals targets of charity or of discretionary policy. The whole idea of entitlement that is underneath the notion of rights, it seems to me to be a recognition of the importance of this dimension of dignity as a way of not making those that are vulnerable and in need seem as though they're somehow deficient and needing of charity. And I think that's very important for the whole psychopolitics of addressing economic inequality.
Do you want to?
No, I think there are two advantages, very similar with what Radhika and Richard said about using the language and the framework of human rights. The first is that if you say that at least extreme inequality is a human rights problem, then you begin winning the discussion. It's for the others to, the others cannot say, no, there's not a problem of, we have very high levels of economic inequality, but that's the way we are, because you are violating human rights. Then you are in a weaker position in a public discussion. Of course, that's not enough, but that gives strength to the fight for more equal societies. And the second is what Radhika said, there are institutions that work with human rights but not with other issues. So if you are not able to frame the discussion in a human rights language, then you cannot go, for instance, to the in the Inter-American system, to the Inter-American Commission or to the court, the Inter-American Human Rights Court. So it gives you some avenues that you cannot go if you are not, if you cannot frame this in the language of human rights. Of course, there are also costs of using this language. We know that. But if you use it in a subtle way, it can be a very powerful instrument.
Well, I think you have to.
I'm going to have to
chime
dissent. I think these high-level abstractions, inequality and human rights, have their place. But as mobilizing tools, the specific and the concrete is much more effective, in my view. And I think one of the things that we've observed in this political season is the emergence of a campaign that was built primarily around the specific and the concrete, that is to say, around the fight for 15, around universal health insurance, around debt-free education, around overturning Citizens United, getting money out of politics, ending the corrupt political system. And that has resonated with many, many more people, precisely because it points to specific things that can be done around which political campaigns can be mobilized. And the fight for 15 is succeeding. It has succeeded first in Seattle, then California, and New York, and it will not be long before it is built into federal law. So it strikes me that this is very much in the tradition of the New Deal line of thought, where when you go back to, say, someone like Adolf Berle, the primary objective here was to get the Social Security Act passed, not to bring about socialism in America, but to pass that act and to pass the minimum wage and the Fair Labor Standards Act and to get specific things done. So I say I think there's a role, particularly in creating a kind of transnational universal discourse here and providing some hooks into international forums. When you're talking about mobilizing people, it's much better to offer them things that actually affect their lives in an immediate and direct way and in a way which the progress toward achievement can be measured.
So we're going to open up to the audience in a moment, but I suspect that one or more of the three other people might want to say it's not an either or something like that.
I was going to say that.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, you, in some way, Jamie, you just quoted Jeffrey Sachs, who said that human rights are aspirational and economics are technocratic. And I don't think that that's necessarily a correct distinction. I don't think human rights are aspirational or vague. They can be very concrete. It's a concrete way of looking at something that is based in dignity and rights rather than charity. So the 15-hour minimum wage is a human rights issue. I mean, and you can have $15 and talk about it in terms of human rights. So I don't think the concrete numbers are not necessarily a part of human rights language. I think the more that we have concrete numbers in human rights language, the better and more forceful. So one of the things I've been trying to do is to convert a lot of economists to give concrete numbers to human rights issues. So I don't think there's one or the other. I think they can coexist at the same time.
Yeah. Yes, in the same vein than Radhika. Of course, you are making an abstract discourse, but when I say that there are some rights that have more equalizer potential than others, these are concrete rights. For instance, the right to form trade unions. We know in a sociological way that the more trade unions that you have, there is a strong relationship between the strength of the trade unions in a country and economic equality. So that's a right in which you say, I want to use human rights to achieve economic equality, then you can focus on certain rights and make specific claims about that rights. That's the reason, because there's sometimes a disconnection between the discussion about economic inequality and human rights, because human rights claims are always concrete, and they don't see they don't analyze usually the impact in the overall structure of the society, and if they have a good or bad impact in economic equality. So that's for us scholars to do it. But the claims in human rights are always very concrete. We want gay marriage. We want some kind of a fair wage. We want to be free to form trade unions. These are the concrete social rights. And that's the relationship between these concrete claims and the overall structure of economic inequality. I think, of course, that it's very difficult to mobilize people just to reduce economic inequality. I agree with that.
Do you want to chime in? And I don't know, Jamie, if you want to say, just respond to these responses. I mean, one thing that strikes me is that this is part of the difficulty is sometimes we're talking about law, and sometimes we're talking about demands that come about. Well, maybe I should say we're talking about constitutional or international human rights claims, right? And other times we're talking about that will get us to particular laws or legislation. And other times we're just talking about getting to the legislation. So
the minimum wage, of course, is a law.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
But it's how you get to it.
What strikes me is, I mean, where I'm wary of these broad abstractions. I'll leave human rights to the lawyers and just talk about inequality. It's mentioned earlier that President Obama had given a speech in which he made this claim that inequality was the great moral challenge of our time. Okay. Does he favor a $15 minimum wage or not? The answer to that question is almost surely no. That he does not, if he takes the advice of his economists, to whom he will turn, he will get the message from them that, no, this would be a risky thing to do, and maybe we should go to 12 sometime in the distant future, but not 15. All right? So it strikes me that one needs, in order to define the issue in a sensible way, and I don't know that 15 has got a greater claim as a human right than 12, but it's a very powerful political movement, and it's one with which it seems to me progressive forces should be allied, precisely because it is a powerful political movement. And if you want to win, you ally yourself with powerful political movements. That's my basic philosophy of politics.
If they're powerful political movements about things you want to succeed.
Well, I mean, if you can ally yourself with a powerful political movement, then you have a greater chance of success. Yes, sure.
Okay, so
just a word in defense of abstraction. It seems to me that what's important about somebody in Obama's position saying what he did about economic equality is to put it on the political agenda in a way that it wasn't before, and it makes the pursuit of these specific objectives more in keeping with what the mainstream debate about policy is at a given time. And in that sense, it makes more plausible the addressing a series of specific grievances within society. And so I don't see the I think you need both abstraction and specific application to develop a coherent response to inequality.
Okay, so with that, we will open up the discussion to the audience. There is someone with a microphone, and there is someone with a question. So, Dick, if you could just wait till Natalie gets you the microphone. Thank you.
So I want to utter a number of abstract words, because that's what I do. So there is a famous philosophical article called The Empty Concept of Equality. There would also be an article that you could write called The Empty Concept of Inequality. That is to say, you must specify the egalization. What is it that is supposed to be distributed equally? And I'm going to focus on vertical distributive justice, not on corrective justice or other sorts of things. So there are a number of different positions that can be taken. I'm going to assume that there's no correct, universally applicable conception of distributive justice. Some focus on specific just wants, a just want for housing of a certain quality or something else. And that might be desired in itself without any further background explanation. There, inequality is not really at stake. It may be connected to inequality that people do not have that amount of housing, which they are allegedly entitled to, but it's a separate value. There is equal resource egalitarianism, the view that every creature that has rights is entitled to the same amount of resources. That's very focused on a concept of equality. There is equal utility egalitarianism. Everybody should have the same amount of utility. That might be associated with quite different amounts of resources going to different people. There is a liberalism. There is what I call liberalism. Liberalism is a normative position which places the highest value on people having a meaningful opportunity to take their lives morally seriously. There is a prerequisite of having a certain amount of resources, a certain kind of education, a certain kind of nurturing. That might connect to inequality empirically, but basically it's, again, a minimum amount of resources people have to have. There is another branch of liberalism which talks about inappropriate subordination of individuals, that people are subordinated when they have less than other people do for reasons of brute luck. It's not because of choices they made for which they can be held responsible. I'm subordinated to you if I do worse for you, even though we've made the same choices because of genetic endowments or other sorts of things that make me less productive than you are. There is another conception of human rights which are called libertarian. Roughly speaking, it's that people are entitled to keep whatever they've added to the dollar value of the social pie. That does not distinguish between capacities that people have to produce for which they are morally responsible because they made choices that built up the capacities, and brute luck. I don't think that even counts as moral. All I'm trying to say is there are these different conceptions of inappropriate inequality or of what people are entitled to get. And if there isn't some correct, universally applicable concept of equality or inequality, you have to deal with the variation.
And would you like to pose a question to the? I guess one question would be:
if the topic is inequality in human rights, you must have a conception of inequality and a conception of human rights. And if you're very concrete, this is to do with what Professor Falk was saying. Yes, you can work from conclusions about concrete issues and try to derive from them an underlying conception of inequality in human rights, or you can work from top down with a conception of inequality in human rights and examine their implications for the resolution of concrete issues, or it may be you need a reflective equilibrium between the two. These things are not at war with each other. I think to do good work, as Professor Lloyd was suggesting, you must take into account observations on both sides.
Yeah, I assume the question, if anybody wants to take it up, would be what conception of inequality are you, or conceptions, right, are you addressing, or should we be addressing? So, does anyone want to respond more?
I'm happy to take a gander at this. One of the reasons I chose to focus on creditor-debtor relationships, because they are a legal relationship, and the specific things I mentioned, financial regulation, usury laws, access to bankruptcy, are in effect regulatory mechanisms that govern the extent to which that legal relationship can be abused by the more powerful party. And that strikes me as a useful way of thinking about what degree of inequality is acceptable, desirable in a society. So I find the kind of aesthetic and utilitarian notions that you're describing to be very, let's say, two-dimensional, in the sense that I find it very hard to relate to them as an economist for guidance to the kind of a social order that would seem to me to be most attractive. And what the kind of thing I'm mentioning is actually a functional relationship or an instance of a functional relationship. And to broaden that out a little bit, there's very good reason to think that within a reasonable range, societies that are more egalitarian, particularly in their structure of wages and in their tax structures, tend to enjoy lower rates of unemployment. Very straightforward reason for that. When you have a high degree of inequality, people quit the bad jobs in order to get the small number of good jobs. They leave the countryside for the city. They leave the farms for the factories. They crowd to New York trying to find a ticket of entry to Goldman Sachs, right? And meanwhile, many of them are unemployed, waiting for those chances that aren't going to come. So this is a phenomenon that is less prevalent in more egalitarian societies, and people spend more of their time productively employed. Secondly, societies which keep control of the degree of inequality tend to have, over time, somewhat higher productivity growth rates. And the reason for that, which was known to the Swedish trade union economists Wren and Meidner in the 1950s and was the basis of Scandinavian social democracy, is that when you put pressure on your less productive firms by keeping wages up, they can't rely on cheap labor to stay profitable. So they either have to improve their techniques, or they have to go elsewhere. And conversely, more productive and advanced businesses find the climate congenial, and your overall living standards tend to rise. Thirdly, there is a tendency when inequality is rising for that to be closely associated with the kind of out-of-control credit phenomena that lead to cycles, to busts, which are intrinsically wasteful and deeply destructive of people's lives, and therefore do infringe, as I said earlier, on human rights. So from the standpoint of constructing a functional methods of governance, it strikes me that there are practical reasons to favor this kind of regulatory mechanism which keeps inequality under reasonable control, and that would be the standard I would offer.
I think it's an important question, and I would like to answer it this way. The way I use it, and I think all in this panel use it more or less the same way, is we are using a descriptive notion of economic inequality as a more egalitarian society in relation to income or to property. That is, if you have all the people have the same share, you have strong economic equality. If one person has all the property and all the income, you have the extreme inequality. The discussion if that is just or not, and that refers to other notions of equality, is very important. What we try to show is the relationship between this phenomenon and human rights. And I think we assume human rights as human rights as they are as legal norms in the international law. Of course, there are other notions of human rights. And we try to show these relationships. So some says that there is not a problem of extreme economic inequality because there is not a human right in the international legal sphere about a right to some kind of economic equality, and what we try to show is that there are strong tensions in which if you have strong economic inequality, then your outputs in human rights are bad. But of course, you have other notions of equality, and a libertarian can say you have strong economic inequality, but it's equality according to merit because it's the more fit that have gained more income. And that's the discussion. What we try to show is that that's not the case.
Thank you all. Let's take another question. Well, we have 20 minutes, so.
Let me preface this by just mentioning a conversation I had at the coffee shop the other day. This guy was, there were two money managers there. One was a modest money manager from Austin, and then the guy that he introduced me to was, when he had really wealthy clients, this guy was in San Francisco, and he referred the clients to this guy because he was really big time. Now, this guy felt like that the processes that were at stake in globalization were inexorable, that you couldn't really stop them. And that the thing that seemed to concern him was that as you begin to eat into the middle class and even the upper middle class, there would be social instability. And I think that I detected in this thing, he's got a big house in San Francisco, that he's worried that a bunch of people are going to show up with pitchforks and, torches and everything. That's what he's concerned about. But at the same time, he said that you have to move forward with these kind of technological advances and everything to enhance the return on capital. Now, isn't it more advantageous in terms of discussing these kinds of issues about inequality to talk to people like that in terms of, don't you want to prevent social rupture, and don't you want to ensure a certain kind of cohesion in the society so that you don't feel threatened, and talk about ameliorating this disparity in wealth that way? If you say to him that you should expand, you use Keynesian economics and you expand the welfare state, or do what Bernie Sanders is talking about, he will tell you that the state is what the problem is. They've screwed up. That's why we have these problems. I think he understands disruption and how do you use human rights and the language that you're talking about to advance this kind of dialogue about possible disruption and social cohesion.
So you want to... yeah. So how to be less... What other strategies other than your social welfarism or human rights strategies, right? Is that the...
Well, I think the important point to remember about the situation of the individual you're speaking of is that this is not something which is fixed in time. And we have an institutional solution we have had for a century in this country, an institutional approach to this problem, which is to say, yes, in an economy organized on private sector principles, there will inevitably be large accumulations at various moments associated with the rise of new industries. And that's what happened in San Francisco, in Santa Clara, San Mateo County, around Seattle. And you see vast fortunes that were built up very quickly as a result of the capitalization of the information technology sector. Good. All right. But is there any case in a democratic republic for allowing those accumulations to become concretized into dynasties over time. No, there's no case for that. Those accumulations were certainly accrued to individuals at particular moments, but we have a general social consensus that the grandchildren of those individuals are not entitled to be President of the United States or United States senators in general. And in fact, it's one of the most deplorable things about our society is that that's what tends to happen, is that you get a rentier class that passes down wealth and power through the generations. How do you avoid that? Well, you tax these things at death. At that moment, you can freeze the estate, in a sense, assess it, and if it is still intact, you can tax a large part of it away. And the fact of that tax then incentivizes people to do the right thing, not through government, but outside of government channels beforehand, which is to give the stuff away. If it's very large amounts, put it in a foundation. If it's smaller amounts, give it to your alma mater, or to your university, or to your hospital, to your church. There's a wall out here of professorships that have been endowed in this institution on precisely that principle. I think that's an excellent thing, which does succeed in integrating the wealthiest people back into the community for approved purposes in constructive ways. But it's also economically effective because it prevents their accumulations from lying idle for too long. It gets them back into circulation. So if you think about tightening up those rules and making that system work more effectively, I think you've got an answer that is clear. That I doubt that your technology friend could make an argument strongly against it, because obviously you can't seriously argue that all of his grandchildren will be as meritorious as he is. And if they are, they can make their own money. Yeah, okay.
Just a further response to this interesting question. If the social cohesion is being threatened by severe forms of economic inequality, as I think is the case in the U.S. at the present time, two of the political consequences of that is a vulnerability to demagogic politics and a rise of extremist politics. So those that are benefiting from this form of inequality have really an incentive to moderate their greed, so to speak, and create a better social contract between the citizenry and the society. And of course, that's what the labor movement did to many industrial societies. It created a threat to social cohesion of the sort that led to a political accommodation and the negotiation of a new social contract. I think what is absent in many contexts, but particularly here in the U.S., is the unwillingness of the elites to consider the renegotiation of a social contract in a way that benefits the majority of the society and not the 1%.
Very quickly, I think there are two things. One is that economic inequality, Standards & Poor's and the IMF released reports that said inequality is bad for growth. So just as a personal thing, if this level of inequality continues, then the economy is going to also be affected. So your friend, you could tell your friend that maybe your profitability.
Make it clear it's not his friend.
It's not his friend. The person in the coffee shop. And so I think there's issues of the levels of inequality and what it actually does to economic growth in the current economic system. And then the other is, I think it was Adam Smith who said that we need the state as a buffer in the social contract for the avarice of the market, right? So it is about a social contract. And if at the current state that we're in, globally and in particular in the U.S., there is really a capture of the state, as to who is there and who runs it. I think there was a great report out of Princeton where they said the U.S. is a plutocracy, in which they actually showed numbers as to the amount of contributions that went to particular legislators and what legislative outcomes came out of it. And so I think it's very clear that there's a capture of the state, and that means that there is a dismantling of the kind of social contract that we need to have social cohesion, so that they're not worried about people coming to their house and tearing it down.
Okay, so now I see some hands coming up, and right after Rodrigo answers this, we're going to collect some questions.
I know that it's not your friend, but another argument that you can make is that was made by this Canadian economist that says the American dream was built upon the idea that you can have strong inequality, but that doesn't affect the equal opportunities, because you have social mobility. That what he has shown is that the American dream is now a Norwegian dream, that only in societies in which you have some kind of equality or not extreme inequality, you have mobility. That societies with extreme inequality doesn't have social mobility because, as James said, they are going to inherit the power of their parents. So if you are a libertarian, a real libertarian, you should push for some kind of social, basic economic equality, because if you don't have a basic economic equality, you will not have equal opportunity. I don't know if it's a good argument for this guy, but it might be interesting.
He doesn't need social mobility. Okay, so I see a number of hands up, so why don't we collect, say, 3 questions, and then we'll close out this round. So I saw one here. Okay. Well, you have the mic. Where's the, oh, okay.
So my question is whether it's fruitful to see inequality as a human rights injury. It's clear that inequality injures democratic agents, democratic citizenship. That's the argument from plutocracy, that at a certain point you can't sustain a democratic constitutional order, political order, with such extreme economic inequalities. That's likewise with equal opportunity. But neither of those, I don't think, currently stands as a human rights issue. How rich and thick you are, and I'm not, right, international human rights issues. It's controversial in the space I know, which is constitutional law, whether it's a constitutional injury to have a plutocracy. I dare say it's controversial, maybe not even on the table in the human rights space. But it seems to me that that's the thrust of many of these observations, that I'm listening to human rights makers talk about the enfeeblement of democracy, the enfeeblement of democratic citizenship, the rise of plutocracy. Is any of those things a human rights problem? And if it's not, should it be? I don't happen to have a strong view one way or the other. But once you begin talking about economic inequality as distinct from poverty and the deprivation of social and economic rights, those seem to me the kind of questions that you have to address.
Thank you. Natalie up here.
Thank you. I wanted to make a comment also on the challenges that the difference on income within among countries also plays on inequality, and also the responses from the grassroots, from the bottom up. and also bring a case from Colombia. The group that I used to work with, the peace community of San Jose de Apartado, that really question the model of the market, and also question and wanted to assert a right to determine not only what they were producing, but also what they want to consume, the role as consumers, and have more control over really their own model of development. That I think is it really touches the issue of inequality. A rural community that is very poor also having a say on how they participate in the global in the global market, and also having a say about which type of education they want for their members, and also whether they are going to be, whether having an iPhone it's something that they want to do, because if you think about the different level of income within the countries, having an iPhone. It's different if you are a young person from a really poor country than if you are from the global north. So I think that's also it challenges us to also consider the role of the communities when they assert the right. They try to assert the right to have a say on how they play in the globalized world.
Thank you. And maybe we should, so we'll take the last one and then folks can respond.
Thank you so much. Several of y'all have mentioned the inherent inequality of the debtor-creditor relationship. If that's true, and I agree with you, but why then continue to allow the private sector the privilege of creating our money as debt? And allowing this inherent inequality to continue. Why not, as some have said in other places, take back the right of the people to create their own money and spend it into circulation? Because if we continue to allow this inherent inequality in the system, we're kind of like trying to balance the inequality later by somehow regulating the effects of it. In other words, we allow it to go, but we regulate the effects. Why don't we just, in other words, do what we did with religion? Banks shouldn't be making our money any more than churches should be making our laws. Let's separate it, and let's allow the people to create their own money.
All right. So in 3 minutes, I need all four of you to be able to respond. I will say, just you all have been you've been great advertisers for tomorrow's program. So in the morning, we start with a panel on debt, and in the afternoon, we have a panel on tax. So we will continue both of those discussions, which were started here. But why don't we just go quickly, and we'll, Jamie, back this way. So first, Jamie, do you want to respond to one?
First on Willie Forbath's point, which I think is a very good point. The question has to be addressed specifically. What is the human rights injury? It was in anticipation of a thought along those lines that I did cast my remarks in terms of debt peonage, because there is a clear, debt peonage is closely linked to slavery, and there is an interface with a well-defined human rights question there. And that's also my answer to the third question. Given that there have been societies in which debtor-creditor relationships were in fact banned, and those societies operated under substantially more strict coercive principles in many respects, like the Gulag Archipelago, it seems to me that we should take all things in moderation, and it's not a bad thing to have debtor-creditor relationships. It's just a bad thing to have excessive or abusive ones that get out of control.
I will answer only to the question about the weakening of democracy and if it's a human rights issue. I know that I'm not going to speak about American constitutional law, but in international law, you have the right to equal, according to Article 21 of the Universal Declaration, you have interpreted in a systematic way, you have a right to an equal participation in government. And equal participation. If you interpret it according that rights should be guaranteed in equal fashion to all citizens, to all persons. So if you have a plutocracy, you don't have a right to equal participation, so that's an injury. I know that in American Constitutional Court, according to your Supreme Court, it's according to your dollars that you have the equal participation. If you are rich, you have a more powerful participation. But in all other countries in the world, a plutocracy undermines the equal participation in government, so it undermines a political right. The other question, I don't answer it because it's for the next panel that is about global justice, so I let it for that.
Two very quick responses. I think one of the important reasons why it is useful to put a human rights framework around discussions of economic inequality is that it illustrates, and I think the first question raises this issue, it illustrates the importance of connecting economic and social rights with political and civil rights. And the Universal Declaration recognized that. During the Cold War, they were separated, I think, in a rather regressive ideological acknowledged deference to the notion that Soviets preferred economic and social rights, and the West was for civil and political rights. But I think, as I say, I think the fusion of the two and the recognition that implicit in the civil and political rights is a notion of democracy or of certain form of minimal democracy, at least, is embedded there. And I think following from what Jamie said about debt relations, I think it's misleading to talk, to take too seriously their intrinsic inequality, because credit performs useful functions in modern society, in all societies, and the real challenge is to create humane regulation of the debtor-creditor relationship.
Okay, I'm coming between you and your coffee break. I was actually going to say the indivisibility of rights is critical when we look at economic, social rights, and civil and political rights, but also the issue of accountability, participation, and transparency in economic and social rights is also to do with economic policy making, and how do you make that a transparent process that is accountable. And that's it. I don't understand my handwriting.
So I'm going to ask you to applaud in just a moment, but I want to say we have a very short coffee break. It's largely for, the people who are jet lagged, so they get to be at the front of the line. And you're going to see a lot of people you haven't seen in a while because the room is really filled up. So say, I can't wait to get into this panel and then see you at the reception after. So we have a terrific panel beginning in 15 minutes. It is called, Can Human Rights Contest Global Inequality? And we'll take up one of those last questions. Please join me in thanking this terrific panel.